And we have met so many times before. But let me welcome you to this very special session on a very critical aspect of air pollution story that is unfolding very rapidly in India. We will discuss today what we call this mystery pollutant called ground level ozone. We are here to share with you our new analysis and our findings on how ozone is behaving in Delhi and NCR and the 6 big metro cities of India. We will also discuss the health implications of growing threat, this new threat in our cities, in our region, and how regulatory responses now have to get a lot more stronger. But before that, let me first introduce you to our speakers, and especially our guest speaker today, Dr. Sk Chhabra. And many of you know him, and you know about his work, the very valuable work that he has done on the link between air pollution and health. He was formerly with Patalchest Institute, now with Primus Hospital, and he has done, and what the most stunning story that he tells us from his studies, that how children growing up in polluted environments are growing up with smaller lungs. And he has particularly looked in very deep into ozone impacts on lungs and on health. We have with us today are my colleagues. So let me introduce you to Avikal Somvangshi, who's a senior program manager of our urban lab, along with Sharanjit Kaur, and both of them have delved deep into the numerous millions of numbers that have emerged from CPCB's monitoring stations on ozone. And that's what we are going to share with you today, what is emerged from that analysis. What do we need to understand about the ozone problem? And we have with us Vivek Chattopadhyay, who is the principal program manager looking after clean air program in CSC. And he has been tracking the regulatory developments on air pollution, air quality management issues, and has looked into how regulatory responses are evolving as far as ozone is concerned. So what is this conversation all about? So I'll just give a very quick context to this. So this is about summer pollution. And normally, as we see, we see that soon after the winter pollution dies down, the conversation on pollution dashes from crescendo to a whimper. But however, this year, as people are becoming more aware, the conversation has continued. But again, the focus is so much on particulate pollution that of course is a problem, but we are only talking about that. And this has also been a very unusual summer with unprecedented heat wave lashing us, but very early in summer. In fact, as you know, March and April have been the driest and the hottest months in many years. And this has elevated dust levels. But that combined with raging landfill fires, in forest fire in some parts, and even crop fires, all of that contributed to increased particulate levels this summer. But what everyone misses out is the other very dangerous side of the summer pollution story, the growing problem of invisible and highly reactive and volatile gas called the ground level ozone. The summer pollution story is never complete without understanding what ozone pollution is all about. And in fact, we at CSC been raising this issue ever since the nascent beginning of ozone monitoring in the region. We have been warning that this needs attention. This problem will grow and blow up on our face, and we need to prevent that. And yet, this is yet another summer. And there is still no clear policy response to how to integrate ozone in our national and regional clean air action planning process. Poor monitoring of ozone, inadequate data, poor understanding about that pollutant, how that pollutant behaves, impacts, all of that has steaming action. And ozone is a very strange gas. It is not released directly into the air from any source. We always, when we talk of, it's a complex chemical interaction between nitrogen oxide, volatile organic compounds, and all these react under the influence of sunlight to create ozone. And these gases are emitted when we burn oil, gas, coal in industry, in vehicles, and some types of volatiles, these even can come from plants. So ozone can, builds up where pollution is, but it also dissipates where pollution is because it again reacts with other gases to disappear. But what escapes and goes to the cleaner parts, to our rural areas, to the urban periphery, or to the cleaner areas of the region, that builds up. And in fact, it's a dichotomy that, you actually get that kind of pollution, which we normally call clean environment. And this also means that, the rich and the poor are equally affected. And today, when we are looking at the data, and Avikal will be sharing that with you, I was quite stunned to see that one area in Delhi, that is the Karni Singh, that shooting range there, Asola, that remains an ozone hotspot, which otherwise you could consider to be the cleanest part of Delhi. But that's really not the case. So it's very strange gas that we really have to understand. It behaves differently because it depends on the local and meteorological condition, availability of the precursor gases. Its level can be highly volatile and localized. And that's why it can vary widely across the city, across the region, and therefore it needs to be addressed very differently, not like PM. And that is what Avikal is going to explain to you, that how we need to look at ozone, where it is building up and where it is increasing, not just simply average it out. So while we track that, and we will understand the regulations around ozone as well, because it is so volatile, it can be short term, but what we will hear from the doctor that even short duration exposure to ozone can be extremely harmful. And that is also one of the reasons that when we are regulating ozone, we set short-term targets. It is for 8-hour average, for 1 hour average, not like PM 2.5, which is 24-hour average. And we will understand that today, that how ozone has behaved this summer and been behaving over a period of time that Avikal is going to share with us. The other side, and the reason that why we need to be worried about ozone, that's what we'll hear from Dr. Chhabra today, which is extremely harmful gas, and it can trigger, and even short duration exposure can trigger serious health problems. And we will understand that how that is going to, why that happens, what happens, who is vulnerable. In fact, whatever data that exists today, when we looked at the 2020 State of Global Air Report, it says that if you take the 8 standardized rates of deaths attributable to ozone among the, it's among one of the highest in India. And because of the concentration that we are already recording. And it's just not that, even India has also recorded one of the highest increases between 2010 and 2017, almost 17% increase. And this is something, therefore, we need to understand, because we are so fixated only on particulate pollution that we just don't understand these other dimensions of the problem. So as we move forward, and what we will discuss today, that it certainly requires much deeper understanding so that we can get the right public and policy response, and so that we can inform mitigation strategy. And we will be, in fact, India, Delhi, NCR, and all cities of India will be well advised to take early action. Don't let this problem grow. And it is important to recognize this problem as part of the city action plan, regional action plan, under the National Clean Air Program. Otherwise, what is happening right now, that the singular focus on particulate pollution in many ways is getting hijacked by only dust control and road sweeping. And And we are ignoring the toxic PM components from the combustion sources, and we are also ignoring the gases coming from vehicles, industries, stacks, and power plants. And so clearly there, in fact, when very recently we looked at the way cities are spending their funds under NCAP on cleaner action, we found that in large number of cities, and particularly in Indo-Gangetic Plain, about 70% of that fund has been spent on road building and road sweeping. Now, is that the only thing that we really need to do to clean up the air and protect public health? That's what we are going to understand today. That what is that other puzzle in that jigsaw that we need to understand? And this is yet another not much discussed, not much understood side of the problem that we really need to focus on very clearly. So now let's move on and understand that what is the data saying? So what is the data speak on this? So Avikal, you will make the presentation now. So Avikal and Sharanjit, who have analyzed very deeply the ozone data for Delhi, NCR, and the 6 metro cities of India, and what is it saying about this emerging threat in our cities? Avikal.
Thank you, Anumita. Let me just share my slides. Hi, everybody. So as Anumita really nicely put together that what the problem of ozone is, what I will be doing is actually taking you through the data, what has happened this summer across the 6 metro cities of India, and how the ozone levels are behaving, and what is the geographical and temporal spread of this problem. But before I go there, let's clear one thing. There's a lot of confusion among people, even among my colleagues, that what is ozone and what is ozone layer. So people, when we talk about ozone, they start assuming the ozone hole and the ozone layer. Those are two different things. The ozone layer, which had developed a hole, which still has a hole, is the ozone which is found at stratosphere, which is very high above the ground, and it's what we is not in our breathing range. What we are going to talk about today is about the ground level ozone, which is the ozone which is found at the ground level, and which is a very toxic gas, and it becomes problematic in the region because of the other pollution, and when it's exposed to heat and to sunlight, it forms ozone. So as Anumita was saying, that ozone is not actually emitted directly from any source into the environment. It's a byproduct of a complex chemical reaction which happens in the atmosphere. So when the NO2 and VOCs are emitted from the factories, vehicles, any kind of combustion or coming from the decay of plant, when they get sunlight, they react with each other and form ozone. And if there is more NO2 available, that means if the pollution is continuing, then the ozone reacts with the NO2 again and then forms a cycle and keeps going into the cycle. But if by any chance the ozone which is formed gets drifted away into a cleaner space which doesn't have more pollution there, it doesn't have NO2 coming, there's no traffic, there is nothing burning, then it starts to build up, and that's what the problem becomes. And what we are seeing nowadays is, let me start with Delhi, that ozone has become actually a year-long problem in Delhi. If you see the months of April and March and April, almost all days of these months had ozone levels exceeding in the city of Delhi and NCR. So I'm including Gurgaon, Noida, Hyderabad, and Ghaziabad into the mix. And we'll notice that not just it's exceeding at a lot more locations. So for instance, in April, it was exceeding on average on 20 locations in the city compared to any previous time. And in fact, March and April this year have seen the most ozone pollution in last 4 years from which the data was analyzed for this study. And it's not just, it's the highest in last 4 years. And then on average for these 2 months, 16 stations were exceeding the standard. And the duration of this exceedance means that ozone was in the range, is not meeting the standard in the city, was almost 4 to 5 hours, which is a very long duration for this thing. But if you see where are the hotspots of the ozone pollution, you will notice that ozone hotspots are there in the South Delhi. So this is the Karni Singh shooting range at the bottom, which has the highest ozone concentration in the city. Then followed by RK Puram and Lodi Colony, which has the most ozone pollution happening in the city. Outside Delhi, you see a lot of ozone getting developed in Greater Noida, and also at the periphery you have Nachakkar and Narela where the ozone is found. You will notice that the highly polluted part from PM perspective, which is Ghaziabad or the industrial areas in North Delhi, they don't really have ozone. The ozone is actually found in the cleaner part of the city, which are more green and have lesser pollution sources. And this is how it compares. So if you see NOx, where the NOx is found, where the industries are in the city, or where a lot of traffic problems are there, you will see that those places, this is NO2 hotspots, and you will see those are the green spots for ozone. That means if you superimpose there, if you are not getting exposed to high NOx pollution in the city, then you are getting exposed to ozone pollution in the city. And that's a very problematic thing. In fact, if you see it with the PM 2.5 hotspots as well, so this is also within the city, it's where the PM is low, you find high ozone, which is a dangerous trend as such. And ozone is a very interesting gas as such, as I said earlier, that it only gets formed when the sunlight is available and the nitrogen dioxide and volatile organic compounds in the air react to form ozone. And it starts to form during the sunrise and it reaches its peak during the afternoon and then it starts to go down. Interesting thing about this whole process is that the traffic congestion or rush hour during the evening and the morning time, which leads to a lot more NO2 in the environment, actually helps to kill the ozone in the evening. And this was something which was not happening during the lockdown. In the lockdown, which is the green line you see, ozone was continuing into the atmosphere even after the sunset because there was not enough NO2 in the air to kill ozone and make the city free of ozone as such. So that's what's happening. But what we are seeing in Delhi, though it's a very big problem in summer, but it's a problem throughout the year in Delhi nowadays. This is last 4 years as such, and the green lines you're seeing are the only days in the year when there was no ozone exceedance. And you'll see it's decreasing every year, and this year till now, we only had 6 days when there was no exceedance of ozone in the city, which is very strange because even after having cold winters, we are finding ozone in Delhi throughout the winter. There was not a single day during November and December when there was no exceedance in the city about ozone. And you will also see that the month of March and April here, there are additionally more there were additional ozone exceedances happening compared to previous years. Of course, the peak of heat wave during the end of April had the most exceedance happening, but we need to understand that, as Anumita was also saying, that ozone doesn't spread throughout the city. It happens at small pockets, and the people living over there are continuously being exposed to it. A person living somewhere far away will not suffer from it, but the person living at this spot will have severe implications. So we need to look at this pollution in a different way. That's very important. And now that was Delhi, but Delhi has a big ozone problem. But when we decided to see what the other mega cities of India are doing and what kind of ozone problem they are facing, we found that Mumbai is not far behind. Delhi had almost 90 days of ozone exceedances happening during the last 3 months. Mumbai was 75 days and Kolkata 43, Hyderabad 43. So these cities are also having high ozone exceedances. Chennai and Bangalore this year have reported lesser ozone. But interesting thing to note about the ozone problem, though Delhi has the most number of days when the ozone exceeds, but the ozone, how long does it last above the standard, is only 4 to 5 hours, rolling average of 8. But if you see Chennai and Bangalore, they last, when they build up, they last almost 10 hours. And even 1 hour exposure to ozone is dangerous. So these longer duration, though they might not be at as many days of ozone exceedances, but they are whenever it happens in a very dangerous way. So that's something which we need to be concerned about. Now let's go into every other metro city and what's happening. This is Mumbai, and you'll notice that ozone is actually a winter problem in Mumbai. Almost all the days of November, December, January, February, ozone is found exceeding in the city. And it usually dies down during the summer when the monsoon starts. But what we are noticing this year is that it's continuously increasing. We didn't have any dip in the ozone formation as we saw last 2 years. And within Mumbai, you'll see that Thane is the most polluted region. Thane is the most polluted when it comes to ozone pollution. And after that, it's Powai and Navi Mumbai. And if you go down south, even the Kolaba area has high ozone exceedances in the city. But we need to understand one thing, that unlike Delhi, which has 40 monitors within the city, Mumbai has only 21. So we are not able to capture in detail, in granularity, where the ozone is forming in the city because the network of the stations is not that deep. We might be having ozones in the areas in between, but since there is no monitoring, we are not able to see it. Same happens with other cities as well. Now let's see Kolkata. Kolkata, again, ozone is a big winter problem and also a little bit of problem in the summer as well. It dies down during the monsoon, but that's what it is. And there has been a little lesser ozone formation this year compared to previous years in Kolkata. And this is also expected because Kolkata actually didn't experience the heat waves which Delhi did. So maybe that is one of the reasons. And within Kolkata, Victoria, which is the cleanest, the Victoria Memorial is the cleanest part of the city, is the actual ozone hotspot in the city. And the places which you usually expect to be dirty, like Howrah and even southern Kolkata, there is not much ozone to be found there. Victoria is a hotspot for ozone in Kolkata. Let's move on to Hyderabad. Hyderabad has a very weird pattern happening this year. We have a lot more ozone exceedances happening during. Hyderabad has a summer problem, doesn't have ozone during the winters as such. But interestingly, in Hyderabad this year, though the pollution ozone level on average has been high in the city, but exceedances have only been reported from a single place, which is in eastern Hyderabad. So almost all days, like 43 days, there was ozone exceedance happening in this area, and people living over here are exposed to extremely high and continuous exposure to ozone, which needs to be looked into. Now moving to Bangalore. Bangalore used to have a big ozone problem past 2 years, but this year we didn't have any ozone forming in the city, which is strange, and we need to investigate more what happened in the city that we have such less formation of ozone. But even if you look at the city where the ozone is being found, is actually found in the posh neighborhoods near Jayanagar and Silkport. So that's the hotspot for ozone in Bangalore. And when we move to Chennai, Chennai doesn't have ozone during the winter, unlike the other metropolitan cities in the south, because Chennai receives rain in the winter. So because of the rain and the cloudy conditions, you don't get ozone in the winter, but you get it in summer. And like other metro cities, Chennai has a very a sparsely spread ozone monitoring network, so we don't really get much detailed picture of what's happening inside the city. But we are noticing some exceedance happening in the city, and it's huge. And it's found in the industrial zones of Chennai as such, but the problem is the residential and the green area of Chennai, which is about here, has no monitoring, so we don't know. And so that's also a thing to look at. But the question, so it's very clear with the data that ozone is a problem in every city, every mega city of India. It does vary as to when it's happening and to what level it's happening. But the question I want to raise, or we want to raise, is that why don't we get AQI alerts for ozone like we get for PM 2.5? If ozone is so dangerous and it's exceeding so much all across the city. So there are multiple issues with the AQI design itself. So if you see the AQI design for India, you will notice that the ozone standard is defined as 8 hours, but when you move to very poor category, it becomes a 1 hour standard. And this is unnecessary complication which is not explained well, and which leads to a lot of confusion, because when you have the official calculator to calculate AQI, there is no option of putting in 1 hour concentration. And if you don't, and if the higher AQI values are only defined with 1 hour concentration, you will not ever receive those, because you cannot feed that information into the system altogether. So you never get that high, super high AQI alert, because the design of the AQI for ozone is kind of faulty. But that's not the only problem. Another problem which we have is the capping of data, which is done by CPC. So as part of the practice, they kind of delete all the data which crosses 200 in their database. We don't know the rationale for it, but what it does, that this data disappears from the portal, and though this data is available on state agencies, if you go and see there, where data, when the ozone levels reach as high as 500, but it's not there in the CPCB portal. So what does this do when the data disappears? The automatic calculation for AQI, which happens and which is reported on all the apps, it goes blank. So as soon as the pollution level crosses 200, the portal goes blank. That means the AQI disappears. So it looks like pollution has come down. And this is a very big problem, because it's giving wrong information to people. It's actually telling people that the situation is getting better when actually it's getting worse. And this is why we don't get to hear about ozone AQI alert coming, because this is what's happening. Another problem which happens is that CPCB has adopted the same practice of averaging all the stations of the city to report city average, which just doesn't work for ozone, because as you saw on the map earlier, there is half of the city will have no ozone and half of the city will have dangerous level of ozone. And when you average it out, it becomes very small, and then it doesn't show up in the actual AQI bulletins. And that's another issue why we don't hear about ozone in AQI bulletins. So that's another problem. So there's a lot needs to be done, lot needs to be fixed. Not only the public information system, which is kind of defunct because some design issue and some random arbitrary action about data control which has been taken, but also as Anumita was saying earlier, that all the strategies for air quality control and clean air in India right now are focused on PM 2.5, and nobody is actually making plans to control ozone pollution in the cities. And if that is not done properly, we're gonna see even more ozone building up in the city and becoming much bigger threat in the future than what PM is right now. And to stop that from happening, we need to take some more action. So that's it from me and Sharanjit. And back to you, Anumita.
Thank you so much, Avikal. This is fascinating. You know, when you begin to understand the story with data, And the fact what is emerging clearly is not only the fact that the problem is growing, spreading wide, different cities are falling victim to it now. It is just not a Delhi problem. It's so clear, the landscape across the country. But more important, the complexity of ozone, the science of it, and and that's where perhaps people are losing it, not really getting it. That all the layers of complexity that you have just outlined, and also the fact that the science on ozone monitoring is so weak at this moment that we are just not being able to assess and capture the real risk and also communicate that risk to the people. So, Abhikal, I'll come back to you. It's fascinating what we have just heard from you and what the data is saying. So, now we'll move on to Dr. Chhabra. Dr. Chhabra, I mean, you really know it all. I mean, you know why, even though the policymakers and people are still not discussing ozone the way they need to discuss, but you have understood very early on with your studies what you have observed in your scientific investigation that why ozone needs to be addressed on a priority basis. You know the evidence, you know what it does to human health, that amazing study that you have done where you have actually shown what it means to get impacted by ozone. So if you can share that with us, explain to us that why we need to be worried about what is the special challenge of ozone, how it impacts us, impacts the vulnerable, the children, and therefore how that evidence therefore needs to be taken so much more seriously to inform policy making. Dr. Chhabra.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Anumita. And it's a pleasure to be here on your forum to discuss about a major pollutant which we have always ignored. Now, at the outset, let me apologize because I am speaking from my clinic, so I don't have access to any slides. I'm using a mobile only. So I'll be speaking mostly extempore, so pardon me if...
Dr. Chhabra, you have shared one slide with us. So whenever you want, if when you signal us, we can share it from our side for you to show it.
Yeah, that's just to highlight the issue. Now, we have heard about the ozone problem and how we are not just doing enough to even understand the extent of the problem, how it is being ignored. Obviously, particulate pollution has always dominated the discourse on air pollution for decades. Now, we have been talking about particulates only. But at the same time, as the data shows, ozone has been a major problem, which has coexisted with particulates. And the studies that Anumita mentioned that I had done, these are about 15 years back, when we're not even talking about ozone. So that was the time when we thought that because our geography and the air pollution data all show that why ozone shouldn't be high. All the conditions are favorable for ozone being high. After all, we live in a tropical country with plenty of sunlight, plenty of vehicles. So the source is there, the catalyst is there. So ozone was bound to be high. And as the data shows that it is a problem. And although the national ambient air quality standards of CPCB, they do mention the levels, both at 1 hour averages and 8 hour averages. And the reason is that unlike particulates, ozone has acute effects. That means that one need not be exposed for days on months to get any effects from ozone. It could be a short-term exposure also. So that is why we have got short-term targets, standards set. Now, before I say something about the health effects, let us understand how ozone affects and why it affects. It's a very active gas and it's not very water soluble. So it means that it will not be scrubbed off in the nose. It's more likely to reach the lower respiratory tract than other pollutants. So it's not, normally our nose is a very good filter. has plenty of moisture, so all water soluble gases will be partly absorbed, but ozone is able to escape. So once ozone reaches the lower respiratory tract, then it generates what are known as oxygen radicals, reactive oxygen species, and which are highly active. They're inflammatory, which means they lead to a kind of irritant effect on the mucosa, leading to increased blood supply there and irritates the nerve cells. So it has acute effects, unlike particulates where one requires a very long exposure to have any significant effects. We talk about ozone levels. We have seen the data from the previous speakers. So there are levels which are monitored, although the data is sketchy and has shortcomings. Now, the impact on a person's health may not be related to the exact level that is being measured in the ambient concentration. The reason is that how much a person inhales, that is going to determine the effect of ozone on health. And the level in the ambient area is just one of the determinants. More importantly, how much air we are breathing and for what duration we are breathing. So the net exposure is a product of our minute ventilation, that is how much we breathe per minute, multiplied with how much time we are breathing in that atmosphere, and then the level in the air. So it means that even the so-called standards, the safe standard, even if the limits are well within those, if the duration is acute, there can be side effects. So these thresholds are very, very rough, and there are plenty of studies which show that levels much below the standard that have been set as being safe, side effects can be there on the mucosa. So therefore, there is no clear-cut threshold that this level of ozone is safe and this is not safe. So our standards, therefore, will keep changing as more and more information comes. And when I say about minute ventilation, it means our ventilation per minute. See, we breathe about 500 ml air per breath, and we breathe 14 times in a minute. So our minute ventilation is 14 into 500, about 6 to 7 liters per minute. When we exercise outdoors, our ventilation goes up 5 times, 10 times. If we stay out longer, there will be greater exposure. So people who are active outdoors, they are more likely to have impact of this exposure. And longer they are in the outdoor atmosphere, so longer the effect will be there. So that is why very active persons who are exercising outdoors or children who are playing outdoors in such levels, they'll be exposed more. So it means ozone level of, let's say, 50 can be harmful to one person and may not be harmful to another person. So that is important to understand, that the cutoffs have these kind of limitations. So it is the exercise, our level of activity, and the time spent outdoors. Ozone is largely an outdoor pollutant, and we know that it has a diurnal variation also. The daytime levels are much higher than the nighttime levels because it requires sunlight to produce this. So coming to the health effects, there are two ways in which we can discuss the health effects. One, acute effects, the other, chronic effects. And then the other way is in apparently healthy persons and in patients or people who have already got a pre-existing lung disease. As far as the acute effects are concerned, acute effects mean that you inhale ozone and after 10-15 minutes, what are the symptoms you are going to get? So if a person is exercising outdoors and ozone levels are high, then there will be inflammation in the airways. Anumita, that picture, if you can show just now. I'll show you a picture of
Can you
airways.
share that photograph? She'll do that right away.
So what ozone will do is it will go into the airways or breathing tubes, and it will set up an inflammatory response. So the mucosa therefore becomes reddish, and it undergoes what is known as bronchoconstriction. That is the caliber of the airways that reduces, and our lung size reduces. And this impact occurs within a few minutes. So when this happens, and one is outdoors exercise. See in this panel now on the left side, this is an internal view. We put in a bronchoscope, that's a telescopic tube the size of a stethoscope, and we can view the airways from inside. So the panel on the left is healthy airways, and the panel on the right is a picture of an airway exposed to ozone, and one can see this reddish hue that is there. So that is inflammation. That is, there is increased blood supply locally, and there is reddish discoloration, and there is swelling in the mucosa. So what this leads to is, that's how we can remove this slide, please. So the airways become smaller, the lung size becomes smaller. So that effect reduces our exercise tolerance. So one cannot exercise for too long when the ozone levels are high. Yes. So our exercise tolerance is reduced, and a person gets sore throat, sensation of burning in the mid chest, irritating cough. So these are the symptoms of acute exposure. Fortunately, these are reversible. So when a person goes home, then in about 4 to 5 hours, this will reverse. So these are the acute effects. Now, what happens if a person is an asthmatic? An asthmatic will have a more risk of getting an acute attack of asthma. His medication requirement will go up. Sometimes an exacerbation, and there are plenty of studies which show that acute exacerbation of asthma occur, requiring these patients to report to emergencies and even hospitalizations. In fact, if ozone can kill, then it is through acute exacerbations of asthma. So it definitely increases the risk of hospitalizations and risk of mortality when there is a pre-existing lung disease. When we talk of chronic effects, then data is a little scanty, especially with regard to the smallness of the lung, whether the long-term lungs in adults. But in children, data has shown that children who grow up in localities or in cities where the ozone concentrations are high, because children are very active outdoors, they'll go out, play in the evening hours coming back from school, and that is the time when the ozone levels are high. So if they spend about an hour or so, they inhale sufficient ozone to have a long-term effect if it is repeated every day. So this will lead to an impact on the growth of lungs. And we have seen that children who grow up, by the time they reach adulthood, their lungs are smaller. So that is a side effect which we need to be concerned about, because ultimately what this will do is that this will lead to greater vulnerability to lung infections and poor exercise performance later on in adult life. And then as they grow older, the lung function normally declines. But in these subjects who have been exposed to high levels of ozone in their childhood, the decline will be faster, and the chance of developing respiratory disease later on in life is more. So this is a very dangerous long-term effect, and which manifests very early in childhood. Another important long-term effect is the development of asthma. And this we showed in our guinea pig models, where we exposed guinea pigs to ozone and to allergens, and a combination of ozone and allergens. Now, allergens are substances in the atmosphere which provoke asthma. And we found that there was a synergistic effect between a combined exposure with ozone and allergens. So new asthma may develop because of ozone. And asthma is one disease where the prevalence is going up. And it is quite possible that ozone is the hidden agent which is responsible for asthma going up. We had shown in our studies in children that about 10% of our children, they have asthma. And that was about 15 years back. No study has been done after that. So it may have increased. Now, asthma is very common in children. So this is an area of growing concern, and that is why we need to act and bring these levels under control. Of course, total exposure being a factor of time spent outdoors as well as exercise. So that also means that parents need to be educated that children must not be allowed to go out and play for too long, especially when ozone levels are high. So we need to have an ozone alert system so that parents are counseled and they can take appropriate action. So lung growth, like I've told, the other disease where new information is coming up is impact on COPD. COPD is a disease in smokers, a respiratory disease similar to asthma, and there also acute exacerbations have been reported recently because of high ozone levels. So ozone has acute effects, it has chronic effects. Ozone has effect on normal persons, and ozone has effects on patients who have got pre-existing lung disease. It's a major problem, and just even a few days of exigencies means a person is exposed to ozone. So acute effects and possibly long-term effects will keep occurring. And the cutoffs, like I said, these are very rough cutoffs. Studies have shown adverse effects of ozone exposure at much lower concentration than what we take as standards. So we have to be cognizant of this fact that the levels that we set as standards, they may not be health-based standards. That is important, and these will continue to be revised as more information comes. So that's it from me, Anamita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chhabra. And so scary to see those pictures. When you see that, in photo, it's so powerful. And also a very powerful message that you have given us that, this whole idea that if we meet the standard, we will be okay. But that's a myth. And what you're actually saying that the levels at a much lower level than the standard can also harm. And we really have to therefore clean up. And in fact, I was quite surprised this time that when WHO had revised given the new air quality guidelines, they really haven't changed it for ozone. Now we are waiting to see that India, which is also now going to revise its standards, the air quality standards, how it is going to inform revise the standards for ozone. But that was really very, very interesting. And I'll come back to you with the whole range of impacts that you have talked about. Not many people understand that. And there is so much, we need to go out and talk to people and put this information out in the public domain that now we can really build support and understanding for what this whole new risk is all about. So taking from what you have said, Dr. Chhabra, this clearly raising a regulatory question now. And that's where Vivek Chattopadhyay, let me ask you, because you have been looking at the way regulations are evolving around air quality management, and particularly ozone, and how, what we know is we know that from different parts of the world that when, where there's a trade-off, that the developed world, they have succeeded in reducing their particulate pollution considerably, but they are falling into a new trap of NOx and ozone. And that is a lesson for us. And we have to understand that we are still so fixated on PM, not being able to fix that. And at the same time, the problem of ozone is growing. And that is the new problem of new technology paradigm. So other governments have responded. So what do we understand from them? What is emerging? So comments from you, Vivek.
Mainly the smog that we talk about in the Western countries, it's largely ozone related smog that we talk about. And in this part of the, in India and other places, when we talk about the smog, it is particulate matter as well as other gases and pollutants. So the action plans that have been prepared in other countries have been very focused towards specific pollutants. And as we know that the same sources emit most of the pollutant. There could be variety of sources also, combustion or non-combustion sources. For example, for control of ozone, one has to have a very strong regulatory framework for controlling NOx. But at the same time, volatile organic compounds have to be found out where it is getting emitted and what control measures we have. For example, whether we have vapor recovery systems installed in the petrol pumps, whether we have solvent control regulations in place. Are we doing the inventory of those sources also? So the regulatory response have been in inventorizing these sources,
Vivek, can you
identifying
speak
control
closer to
strategies.
the mic? People are not being able to listen to you.
Okay.
Louder,
Am
perhaps.
I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the regulatory response has been like a kind of multi-pollutant strategy. So they identify the sources. They carry out photochemical grid monitoring also, because ozone is very peculiar pollutant, because it could be NOx limiting or VOC limiting. So one has to identify at what level the ozone gets reduced and what pollutant has to be targeted. And the interesting thing is the sources may not be in the rural areas where it is impacting the agriculture as well as the health of the people. So it raises a question that we can't have a city-based action plan also. We have to have a regional plans specifically for ozone. And it is doable. There is a global learning in this regard. And as we know that vehicular emissions have been tightened a lot. In future, we are going to have more NOx control in the real world driving conditions also. But at the same time, our NOx controls have to be stronger in thermal power plants, other industries, and we have to have a VOC action plan, because these precursor gases themselves are problematic from the health point of view, as well they create another problem of ozone. So I think as our national clean air program has totally missed this point. They have mainly focused on particulate matter reduction. We have to have a NOx reduction target as well, VOC reduction target, as well as ozone reduction target for our cities. I think that has to be made part of our regulatory framework. Thank you.
Absolutely, Vivek, you're spot on. And the fact that, we really have to develop now what we call a multi-pollutant approach. And, but in the meantime, while you were talking, I could see some of the questions that are coming up. There's one question that I see, that any bioindicator for ozone pollution. Now, I don't know, Dr. Chhabra, whether you would like to take that on. But also, if you can add that, today, where do you think are the barriers to doing more studies on ozone? And even when you were doing your own study, what is the the limitation in terms of getting data, in terms of generating the right kind of information, and how do we get the health community more involved? Even though we know that we really don't have to reinvent the wheel, a lot of research have happened globally, but it is always important to know what's happening here. And so, what is your reflection on that?
Definitely, we should always be generating our own data. But like you say, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if we don't have enough studies going on at the moment, so that need not be any limitation on our efforts to take action, because there's enough literature available, and literature on ozone, you'll be surprised to know, is at least 4 to 5 decades old. And unfortunately here, because we were always focused on particulates, so we never sat up and thought about what is known as oxidizing pollutants. Even in US, where most of the cities, the particulate concentrations are well within the standards, ozone exceedances are higher than particulate exceedances. So their oxidizing pollutants are the major concern. And so the same is true for India also. Definitely we need people to develop interest. We need people to carry out studies. But unfortunately, I don't see many studies being conducted right now in any of the major institutions. So I really don't know what is the reason. But I suppose we need more collaborations, like your organization and then Government of India, they can take up projects. CPCB does carry out studies, but these are small scale studies. Even and their studies are confined to small localities, that can possibly budget constraints are there. So budgetary problems will always be there in India. So we can always draw lessons from the published literature and take our actions. The other question was about bio. I didn't get the question.
We asked that are there bioindicators for ozone impact of ozone pollution?
Bioindicators.
Yeah.
Well, there are two kinds of effects, like I said, acute and chronic. And acute impact can easily be shown if you do a lung function study. For example, you take a control group and you take a cohort which is exposed. They are exposed outdoors, like children going out and playing for some time. And the studies have been carried out this way, that they do a breathing test, a spirometry, and then after 4 hours, they do spirometry again, and that shows a reduction in the lung capacity. That is documented. So that is a bioindicator of acute impact of ozone.
Avika, very quickly, we have with just a few minutes left. So from what you have just been, this whole analysis that has happened, I mean, what will be the takeaway? How do you feel that, where is the challenge in building a public conversation around ozone? And
it's for me?
Yes. No, I was asking this to Abhikal actually, but if you would want to reflect, you can do that.
See, I've always held that pollution is everybody's problem. If we want to say that only government has to take action and we'll just breathe clean air, that's never going to happen. So whatever is our contribution to the problem, we as citizens have to take our actions.
Right.
Be more responsible.
Absolutely. So that's where I will connect, Avikal, because what you were showing, that if AQI is one of the method of communicating data to people, and what you have shown that where are the limitations today in capturing the real risk of ozone through AQI, given the complexity of ozone, monitoring its standards, and the way AQI is crafted. So have you seen any good practice globally, and how we can further improve on that?
Yeah, so if you look at the US or even Europe, they have their AQI for ozone and their ozone alert system are quite independent, and they're defined both at 8-hour level and 1-hour level, and whichever breaches, the alert is sent out. And in fact, the cities are very prompt in sending these ozone alerts out. And one of the actions which is taken in, at least in US cities, is that they ask people to not go and fill gas during the daytime. Because when you fill gas, these the benzene and oil gets in the petroleum and the diesel evaporates, and that adds to is one of these compounds which helps in formation of ozone. So that's they say, if you have high ozone happening in the city during the daytime, please avoid filling gas and do it after the sunset. So that is one way of dealing with it. But they have a very specific independent system of sending out ozone alerts, and that's determined by, you don't wait 24 hours to give ozone alerts. You have to give it instantly, so they have a shorter term AQIs and alerts which are given. Not like the CPCB's current, the AQI alert comes a day later. So that doesn't work for ozone. And also the question you were asking earlier, what are the complications with this thing? As we had seen during the lockdowns, when all the pollution sources were gone down, ozone in the city went up. So there needs to be a balance. The ozone is formed by NO2, but for it to disappear, we also need NO2. So there needs to be a balance between the two. Just getting rid of NO2 will not actually get rid of ozone, which we had experienced during the lockdowns in our own cities across the country. So there has to be much nuanced understanding and much nuanced planning for tapping this gas. and this polluted than just simply shutting down industry or opening, putting up some kind of filter or anything. This requires much more research and much more detailed planning to deal with it, which is not happening right now. And as Dr. Chhabra was saying, the research on this is very poor. We need to pick up the research and make this agenda for everybody to look at.
Absolutely. So, in fact, it's very interesting to see a lot of questions coming in. So, there is one question, and I think Dr. Chhabra, you can give the health reason for this. The question is, as we were saying, as Avikal has also been explaining, that the standards that CPCB set for ozone is for shorter duration. It is either 1 hour, 8 hours, right? So the question is that why so? Is there a specific reason for that? Of course, the reason is health. So if you can explain the importance of regulating ozone for short duration exposure.
Well, some of the earlier studies, they were carried out at these concentrations. See, the 100 microgram, that's roughly about 50 parts per billion ozone. So the initial literature showed that this level definitely produces adverse effects, and that is very well documented. Later on, because it is ultimately a function of duration also, and the level of breathing. So therefore, the standards can never accurately predict that at this level there will be no effects, at this level there will be effects. So a person who is sitting at rest at 100 micrograms per cubic meter, he may not have any symptoms, but a person who is exercising at 80 will have symptoms. So that is the problem in setting standards for ozone. So it's a trade-off, how much we can achieve first. Is it achievable or not? So that will be a major factor.
Absolutely.
So that is why the standards will keep getting revised as our efforts start bearing fruit and we start lowering it. No point saying that we'll set our target to 50 if we cannot achieve that.
Right. So what?
Just to add to Doctor, the standards are set at 8 hours and 1 hour because you cannot expect people to breathe longer duration of this high level. You need to take action within 1 hour and 8 hours, not like when the PM levels are exceeding, you have 24 hours to take action from that perspective. When ozone is exceeding, you have only 8 hours to take action to bring it down to reduce the impact on human health. That's why these are smaller duration. And that's why we don't have longer duration thing, because it doesn't make any sense. If you're exposed for 8 hours to that level, the damage is already done. There is no point of looking for what is going to happen after a week or a year. So that's why the standards have only short term. And it's not just India, it's all around the world.
It's all over. And that's exact. So the whole message here is that high ozone can have an immediate trigger effect the moment it is high and wherever it is high. And we need to take action right then and right there. And that's what the whole standard is trying to guide us to do. So now looking at the time, thanks Sati and Dhanshu for asking those questions. But let me take this just one question before we end, which is from Taufik and Vivek. This is the question, but they're saying that in terms of mitigation action, a lot less has happened to control SO2 NOx and NOx control particularly. And so the question is that what are the recent developments in terms of addressing NOx levels in the atmosphere? So we do understand that the NOx is one of the not a big focus of the mitigation problem. So anything that you would want to reflect on, because NOx largely associated with vehicles, but we have taken leapfrog decisions. But yes, tell us.
Yeah, particularly in the NOx from the new vehicles, the standards have been tightened significantly. So we have leapfrogged from BS4 to BS6. That has cut down the NOx from new vehicles more than 80%. But it's only new vehicles. So we have problem of legacy vehicles, huge number of diesel vehicles, which are known to emit high NOx levels, and also other high combustion sources like power plants, industries, they emit high NOx. Their regulations have to be tightened, low NOx burners, selective catalytic reduction devices. So our standard NOx standards have to be more technology forcing in cutting down the NOx, and that is doable because we have a learning curve also, and as we know that any introduction of new standard would require investments, but the health benefits that we gain cumulatively is much higher. So it outweighs the cost of standards, meeting the standards. So I think that has to be the strategy for meeting the NOx standards in future, because it is a huge trade-off. Once we reduce carbon monoxide, particulate matter, we have to deal with NOx. That will remain a major problem in coming years.
Absolutely. So I think now we just don't have no time left to continue this fascinating and very exciting conversation and much needed conversation. And I'm so glad that we have been able to bring this to attention and to draw public attention, and with all that data analysis that we have done. But the messages are so clear. As Dr. Chhabra has explained, that the health is the most compelling reason that why we cannot ignore ozone anymore. We have started generating the data. Data is showing that we're already getting into a problem area, and yet we are so unprepared. And the health evidence really has to propel and drive the policy action now. And this means that the current focus on particulate pollution, which certainly needs to be strengthened even more. But now let's think about that. As we do that, how can we refine the strategies more for co-control of multiple pollutants from the same sources? And with the same investments, if we are careful, if we define our strategies well, and particularly focus more strongly on combustion sources, wherever we are burning fuel, whether industry, power plant, and vehicles, because that's where this whole complex emissions are taking place. So those will really have to be the big part of the focus. And if we have understood that, the National Clean Air Program, as well as the regional and city level programs, will really have to now be redesigned to be able to integrate this approach. And this approach not only should address multiple pollutants, it also has to take a regional approach, because this kind of pollutant, as we have seen, that ozone might get created somewhere, but it is also going to drift somewhere else. And there's a whole regional movement of that. And not only ozone, it is also particulate pollution. And unless we address that regional dimension through our mitigation strategy, we will not be able to address this problem. So clearly, therefore, the message is very clear. But in this, the people will really have to be the partner, because its health impact is so huge, it's so immediate, it is so tangible, that we really have to ask for the right kind of strategies to disseminate information, to inform people so that they can reduce their exposure when ozone levels go up anywhere, anytime. But all of that is possible. What is also emerging from our analysis is that science of tracking ozone, science of quantifying communication, and the communication part of that data, and science will have to be much, much stronger. Our air quality monitoring will have to be strengthened across the country. Today, that's the large part of India is not part of the ozone map, because we are not even tracking that data. But there are so many ways of doing that. You can even use satellite images and that data to begin to address the data shadow areas. So while we certainly have to focus on generating more data, but it also has to be quality data. All those caps on data has to be removed, and we need to communicate and adopt the right methodology for computing AQI and communicating the ozone-based information. So the science of ozone has to be much stronger to inform our policy action. So with that, let's conclude, and thanks so much, Dr. Chhabra, Avikar, Vivek, and this was a fascinating conversation, and Sharanjit, you being there as part of this analysis. So thank you very much, and thank you, audience. I mean, it has been great to have all of you with us today, that we could have this engagement and with you, so that we could share what we understand, what we know, but as you also have understood, that it is a big problem in the making right now. And all of us together need to therefore come together and build good public support and ask for very strong policy action. Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.